In the autumn of 2008, the peaceful campgrounds of Crystal Lake were shattered by a mother's desperate screams. 4-year-old Emma Johnson had vanished from her family's tent sometime during the night, leaving behind only a rumpled sleeping bag and a small stuffed bunny. But 12 years later, her mother Sarah would discover something that would turn her world upside down. A secret so twisted it would reveal that the person she trusted most had been her greatest enemy all along. And the daughter she thought was lost forever had been closer than she ever imagined. Sarah Johnson sat in her kitchen staring at the cold cup of coffee in her hands. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. It was October 15th, Emma's birthday. She would have been 16 today. 12 years had passed since that terrible night at Crystal Lake. 12 years of searching faces in crowds, of jumping every time the phone rang, of living with the suffocating weight of guilt that pressed down on her chest like a stone. The memories of that night still haunted her dreams. She had been drinking around the campfire, trying to ease the tension between her husband David and her brother Mike. The two men had never gotten along, and wine had seemed like the only way to get through the weekend. She remembered stumbling back to the tent around midnight, leaving the men arguing by the dying embers. The world had been spinning from too much alcohol, her movements clumsy and unsteady. She had checked on Emma, seeing her small form curled up in her sleeping bag, clutching that worn stuffed bunny. Sarah had collapsed into her own sleeping bag, too drunk to properly zip it up. Too drunk to stay awake. Too drunk to hear whatever had happened next. When she woke up 6 hours later, her head pounding and her mouth dry as cotton, Emma was gone. The tent flap hung open, moving gently in the morning breeze. Emma's sleeping bag was empty, still warm from her small body. The stuffed bunny lay abandoned on the ground, its fur damp with dew. Sarah's screams had echoed across the lake, waking every camper within a mile. David had come running, his face pale with terror. Mike had emerged from his own tent, disheveled and confused, and then had come the frantic search, the desperate calling of Emma's name through the trees. But there had been no answer, no trace, no sign of where a 4-year-old girl could have gone in the middle of the night. Her husband David moved quietly around the kitchen now, making his breakfast with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. Toast, 2 minutes, coffee, black, orange juice, exactly half a glass. He never acknowledged these anniversary dates anymore, never spoke Emma's name unless absolutely necessary. Sarah watched him from the corner of her eye. His brown hair was greying at the temples now, and lines had formed around his eyes. But he was still the same steady, reliable man she had married 14 years ago. The same man who had held her while she sobbed in those first terrible months after Emma disappeared. The same man who had never once said it was her fault, even though they both knew it was. The police had questioned everyone. David, who claimed he had stayed by the fire until dawn, dozing in his camping chair. Mike, who said he had gone to bed around 2 in the morning after the argument. The other campers in nearby sites, the campground staff. But they all had alibis, they all had explanations. And in the end, the investigators concluded what everyone already suspected. A 4-year-old had wandered away from an unguarded campsite and been taken by someone passing through, a predator who had seen an opportunity and seized it. The media had been merciless. They called Sarah the drunk mother who had been too intoxicated to protect her child. They questioned how someone could pass out so completely that they wouldn't hear their daughter leaving the tent. They implied, without ever saying it directly, that her drinking had cost Emma her life. "I'll be late tonight," David said, not looking at her as he put on his jacket. "Board meeting." Sarah nodded. She couldn't remember the last time they'd had a real conversation. They existed in parallel lives now, sharing the same house but never really connecting. The grief had built a wall between them that neither seemed able to climb over. After David left, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the silence. This was her life now, this careful, quiet existence where nothing unexpected ever happened, where she went to her job at the library, came home, made dinner, and tried not to think about the little girl who should have been starting her junior year of high school. A headache was building behind her eyes, the familiar throb that meant she needed medication before it got worse. Sarah climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, heading for the medicine cabinet in the attached bathroom. She stood on her tiptoes, reaching for the basket where they kept their medications. Her fingers brushed against the plastic edge, and the whole thing tipped over, spilling bottles and packets across the bathroom counter and onto the floor. Sarah knelt down, gathering the scattered items. Ibuprofen, David's blood pressure pills, her antidepressants, a few expired prescriptions that should have been thrown away years ago. And then she saw something that made her freeze. A small white box partially hidden under the bathroom mat. She picked it up with trembling fingers, reading the label twice to make sure she wasn't mistaken. Emergency Contraception Plan B. The receipt was still attached, dated 3 days ago, purchased at a pharmacy in a town called Millbrook, 45 minutes away. A place Sarah had never heard of. She sat back on her heels, staring at the box. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She and David hadn't been intimate in over a year. And even if they had been, she'd had her tubes tied after Emma was born. There would be no need for emergency contraception, which meant this wasn't for her. The box trembled in her hands as the implications began to sink in. David was seeing someone. Someone who needed emergency contraception, someone who lived 45 minutes away in a town she'd never heard him mention. But what disturbed her most wasn't the affair itself. It was the secrecy, the careful planning. The fact that he'd driven so far away to buy something so small, as if he was afraid of being seen, as if he had practice hiding things from her. Sarah stared at the Plan B box for what felt like hours, her mind spinning with questions she was afraid to answer. When she finally heard David's car pulling into the driveway that evening, she quickly hid the box in her dresser drawer beneath old sweaters she never wore anymore. Dinner was the same as always, quiet, mechanical. David talked about his day at the engineering firm, mentioning clients and projects with the same detached tone he used for everything now. Sarah nodded and made appropriate responses, but her eyes kept drifting to his face, searching for signs of deception. Had he always been this careful with his words? This controlled? After he went to bed, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every small sound made her tense. David's breathing, the house settling, a car passing on the street outside. She found herself listening to his sleep patterns, wondering if he was really asleep or just pretending. At 3 a.m, she heard him get up. His footsteps were soft but deliberate as he moved through the house. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear where he was going. The sounds came from downstairs, the kitchen, maybe, or his home office. She waited 15 minutes before creeping out of bed. The hardwood floor was cold against her bare feet as she made her way to the top of the stairs. She could see a faint light coming from the direction of David's office, the small room where he kept his computer and work files. Sarah descended the stairs slowly, avoiding the spots she knew would creak. When she reached the bottom, she could hear the soft clicking of computer keys. David was typing something, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. She edged closer to the office door, which was slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see David's profile illuminated by the computer screen. His face looked different in the blue glow. Younger somehow. More animated than she'd seen him in years. He was smiling. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. When was the last time she'd seen David smile like that? When was the last time he'd looked happy about anything? She strained to see what was on the screen, but the angle was wrong. All she could make out were blocks of text, like he was reading messages or emails. Every few seconds, he would type a response, his fingers dancing across the keys with surprising speed. Then he stopped typing and leaned back in his chair. Sarah saw him reach for something on his desk, something small that he held up to the computer screen. It looked like a photograph. David spoke, his voice so quiet she could barely hear it. "I miss you too, sweetheart." Sarah's heart stopped. The tenderness in his voice, the gentle tone she remembered from the early days of their marriage, was directed at someone else. Someone who wasn't her. Someone who made him smile in the middle of the night. She backed away from the door, her pulse racing. She had to get back upstairs before he finished whatever he was doing. But as she turned to go, her foot caught the edge of the coffee table, sending a magazine sliding to the floor. The typing stopped. Sarah froze, not daring to breathe. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she heard David's chair creak. Footsteps approached the office door. She ran. Sarah took the stairs 2 at a time, not caring about the noise now. She threw herself back into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, forcing her breathing to slow down. When David returned to the bedroom 5 minutes later, she pretended to be asleep. But she felt his eyes on her in the darkness. Watching. Waiting. The next morning, David left for work earlier than usual. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, Sarah went straight to his office. The computer was password protected as always, but she noticed something she'd missed before. A small stack of receipts tucked under his desk blotter. She pulled them out with shaking hands. Gas stations, restaurants, a hardware store. All in towns she didn't recognize, all within a 40-mile radius of Millbrook. All dated within the past 6 months. David had been taking regular trips to places he'd never told her about. Places that required him to fill up his gas tank. Places where he bought meals for more than one person. Sarah sank into David's desk chair, the receipts scattered in front of her. The evidence was mounting, but evidence of what exactly? An affair seemed obvious, but something about the pattern bothered her. The careful documentation, the consistent locations, the way he'd hidden his activities so methodically. This wasn't a spontaneous relationship. This was planned, organized, long-term. She thought about the tenderness in his voice the night before. "I miss you too, sweetheart." The way he'd held up that photograph to the computer screen, like he was showing it to someone who couldn't see him in person, someone who was far away. Someone who needed to see pictures to remember what he looked like. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered up the receipts. She needed to find out where David was going on these trips. She needed to know who he was seeing. But more than that, she needed to understand why he was being so secretive about it. In all their years of marriage, even during the worst times after Emma's disappearance, David had never been dishonest with her. He was many things: distant, cold, emotionally unavailable, but he wasn't a liar. So why was he lying now? That afternoon, Sarah called in sick to work and drove to Millbrook. It was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. She parked on Main Street and walked into the pharmacy where David had bought the Plan B. The clerk was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and greying hair. When Sarah showed her David's picture, the woman's face lit up with recognition. "Oh yes, Mr. Johnson, he comes in regularly. Nice man, always very polite." Sarah's stomach clenched. "Regularly? How often?" "Oh, maybe once a month or so, sometimes more. He usually buys the same things. Personal items, you know, feminine products, sometimes those emergency contraceptive pills." The woman leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I always assumed they were for his daughter. She looks just like him." The world tilted sideways. Sarah gripped the counter to keep from falling. "His daughter?" "Sweet girl, maybe 15 or 16, long brown hair just like his. She waits in the car while he shops. I've seen her a few times through the window." The woman's expression grew concerned. "Are you all right, dear? You look pale." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Long brown hair, just like David's. Just like Emma's had been. Just like Emma's would be now if she were still alive. Sarah sat in her car outside the Millbrook pharmacy for 20 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The clerk's words echoed in her mind like a broken record. Sweet girl. Maybe 15 or 16. long brown hair just like his. Emma would be 16 now. Emma had long brown hair, but Emma was dead, or taken, or... Sarah forced herself to think rationally. There were thousands of teenage girls with brown hair. The clerk had made an assumption based on a resemblance. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. But as she drove home through the winding country roads, Sarah couldn't shake the image from her mind. A teenage girl waiting in David's car while he bought feminine products and emergency contraception, a girl who looked like him, a girl who looked like Emma. That night, Sarah pretended to have food poisoning. She stayed in the bathroom for an hour, making retching sounds while she searched through David's toiletries. Hidden behind a bottle of aftershave, she found a small key she'd never seen before. It was old-fashioned, the kind that opened a padlock or a small storage unit. Sarah stared at it, turning it over in her palm. What did David need to lock up that required hiding the key? She waited until he was asleep before searching the rest of the house. The key didn't fit any of their locks. Not the garage, not the shed in the backyard, not the filing cabinet in his office. Which meant, whatever it opened, wasn't here. The next morning, Sarah followed David to work. She'd never done anything like this before, and her heart pounded as she stayed 3 cars behind his sedan. But David drove straight to his office building, just like always. No stops, no detours. She waited in the parking lot across the street until 5:30, when David emerged with his usual briefcase and tired expression. But instead of heading home, he turned left toward the highway that led out of town. Sarah followed, her hands sweating on the steering wheel. This was it. This was where he went on those mysterious trips. After 20 minutes of driving, David turned off the main highway onto a smaller road that wound through farmland and scattered houses. The road led to a storage facility called Pinewood Self-Storage. David pulled up to unit number 47 and got out of his car. Sarah parked behind a cluster of trees where she could see but not be seen. David looked around carefully before approaching the storage unit. He pulled out a key, the same key Sarah had found in his bathroom, and unlocked the metal door. He rolled it up just high enough to duck inside, then pulled it closed behind him. Sarah waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. What was David keeping in a storage unit? Why had he never mentioned it, and why did he need to check on it so regularly? After 15 minutes, David emerged carrying a large plastic bag. He locked the unit and drove away without looking back. Sarah waited until his taillights disappeared before approaching Unit 47. The lock was solid, professional grade. She couldn't see inside through the small gap at the bottom, but she could smell something clean and chemical, like laundry detergent and disinfectant. The next day, Sarah called a locksmith and claimed she'd lost the key to her storage unit. For $50 in cash and no questions asked, he made her a copy of David's key. She waited until David left for work, then drove straight to Pinewood Self-Storage. Her hands shook as she inserted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the metal door rolled up with a loud scraping sound. What Sarah saw inside made her legs give out. The storage unit had been converted into a living space. There was a small bed with pink sheets and a floral comforter, a dresser filled with teenage girls' clothing, a bookshelf lined with young adult novels and school textbooks, a small refrigerator humming in the corner, and covering every inch of the walls were photographs of Emma. Not the family photos Sarah remembered from their house. These were different, recent. They showed Emma at different ages, growing from a small child into a young teenager. Emma reading a book. Emma brushing her hair. Emma sleeping. Someone had been watching Emma for years. Someone had been taking pictures of her as she grew up. Someone had been keeping track of her life in this horrible, secret place. Sarah stumbled forward, her vision blurring with tears. On the dresser was a school ID card, Emma Johnson, age 16, Cedar Valley, Homeschool Academy. Emma was alive. Emma was 16 years old, and David knew exactly where she was. Sarah's knees buckled and she collapsed onto the small bed. The sheets smelled like strawberry shampoo and teenage girl. They smelled like the daughter she'd lost 12 years ago, the daughter she'd mourned, the daughter she'd blamed herself for losing. But Emma hadn't wandered away from the campsite that night. She hadn't been taken by a stranger. She'd been taken by David. Sarah's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. David staying by the campfire until dawn. David having an alibi. David comforting her in those first terrible months, holding her while she cried, never once suggesting that maybe Emma was still alive. He'd let her believe their daughter was dead. He'd let her carry the guilt and shame of that night for 12 years. He'd watched her spiral into depression and self-blame while he knew exactly where Emma was, while he was keeping Emma somewhere like a secret. Sarah looked around the storage unit again, seeing details she'd missed the first time. There were no windows. The ventilation was minimal. The lock was on the outside, not the inside. This wasn't just a place where David kept Emma's things. This was a place where he kept Emma. Her daughter was being held prisoner, had been held prisoner for 12 years. And Sarah's husband, the man who'd comforted her, who'd never blamed her, who'd seemed like the only good thing left in her life, was the one who'd taken her. Sarah heard a car engine outside and froze. Through the gap under the door, she could see headlights approaching. Someone was coming. She quickly pulled out her phone and took pictures of everything she could see. The bed, the dresser, the photographs on the walls. Evidence that Emma was alive. Evidence of what David had done. The car engine got closer. Sarah rolled down the storage unit door and locked it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key to turn. She ran to her car and drove away as fast as she dared, checking her rearview mirror to see if anyone was following. But the road behind her stayed empty, dark, silent as a grave. When Sarah got home, David was already there, making dinner like nothing had happened, like he hadn't spent the day at work, while their daughter sat locked in a storage unit 40 minutes away. "How was your day?" he asked, not looking up from the stove. Sarah stared at him. This man she'd shared a bed with for 14 years, this man she'd trusted with her life, her heart, her grief. This man who'd stolen their daughter and let her believe Emma was dead. "Fine," she managed to say, "just fine." Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emma's face in those photographs. Older now, but unmistakably her daughter. The same brown eyes, the same delicate features, the same stubborn set to her jaw that Sarah remembered from when Emma was 4 years old. But there had been something else in those recent pictures. Something that made Sarah's chest ache with a pain deeper than grief. Emma looked different, subdued, like a light had gone out behind her eyes. What had David done to her? What had he told her about why she couldn't come home? Sarah watched David sleep beside her, his breathing deep and regular. How could he sleep so peacefully? How could he lie there every night knowing what he'd done? Knowing that somewhere 40 minutes away, their daughter was locked in that horrible little room. At 4 a.m, Sarah crept downstairs to David's office. She needed to find more evidence. Needed to understand how long this had been planned. Needed to know if there were others who knew. She tried every password she could think of. Emma's birthday, their wedding anniversary, David's mother's maiden name. Nothing worked. But then she remembered something the pharmacy clerk had said. David came in regularly, sometimes monthly. Sarah tried the date Emma disappeared. October 15th, 2008. The computer unlocked. David's email was filled with messages from something called Cedar Valley Homeschool Academy, progress reports, curriculum updates, tuition payment confirmations, all for a student named Emma Johnson. Sarah scrolled through the messages with trembling fingers. Emma was apparently an excellent student, advanced in math and science, just like she'd always been as a little girl. The teacher's notes were warm and encouraging. They talked about Emma's quiet nature, her love of reading, her artistic talent. They had no idea they were teaching a kidnapped child. But it was the messages in David's sent folder that made Sarah's blood run cold. monthly emails to someone named Dr. Patricia Vance discussing Emma's adjustment issues and medication management. David was having their daughter drugged to keep her compliant. The most recent email was dated 3 days ago. David had written, "Emma has been asking about her mother again. Dr. Vance recommended increasing the dosage temporarily to help with the confusion. Please adjust her prescription accordingly." Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Emma remembered her. Emma was asking about her. And David was drugging her to make her forget. She kept reading, diving deeper into David's digital life. There were financial records showing regular payments to something called Riverside Property Management, rental agreements for a house on Elm Street in Millbrook, utility bills, grocery receipts. David wasn't just keeping Emma in that storage unit. He'd rented her a house. He'd created an entire fake life for her, complete with homeschooling and medical care, and a home where she could live under his complete control. The house address was burned into Sarah's memory. 247 Elm Street, Millbrook. Sarah printed everything she could find before deleting the browser history and shutting down the computer. She had evidence now, proof that Emma was alive, that David had taken her, that he'd been keeping her prisoner for 12 years. But she also knew that if she went to the police now, David would disappear with Emma before they could act. He'd had 12 years to plan this. He would have escape routes, backup plans, ways to vanish that the authorities would never be able to track. Sarah needed to get to Emma first. The next morning, she told David she was visiting her sister in Sacramento for the weekend. "A family emergency," she said. "She might be gone for several days." David barely looked up from his newspaper. "Drive safe," he said. The same thing he'd said every time she'd left the house for the past 12 years. No concern, no questions, no curiosity about what kind of emergency would take her away, because he knew exactly where she was going to be this weekend. He knew because he'd be there too. Sarah packed a small bag and drove to Millbrook. She found Elm Street easily enough. It was a quiet residential area with older houses set back from the road. Number 247 was a modest 2-story home with a fenced backyard and security cameras mounted under the eaves. She parked 3 blocks away and walked back, keeping to the shadows. The house looked normal from the outside. Well-maintained. Respectable. The kind of place where no one would think to look for a missing child. Sarah circled the property, looking for a way to see inside. The windows on the first floor had curtains drawn tight. The second-floor windows were smaller, positioned high enough that she couldn't see through them from ground level. But as she stood at the corner of the fence, she heard something that made her heart stop. Music, coming from inside the house. A piano, played with the careful precision of someone who'd been taking lessons for years. Emma had begged for piano lessons when she was 3 years old. Sarah and David had promised to start them when she turned 5. Sarah pressed her face against the fence, straining to hear. The melody was beautiful and complex, far beyond what a beginner could play. Whoever was at that piano had been studying for years, had been practicing in secret while the world believed she was dead. The music stopped abruptly and Sarah heard voices. A man's voice, low and familiar. David was here. He was inside with Emma right now. And then she heard another voice. Higher. Younger. Uncertain. "Do I have to go back to the other place tonight, Daddy?" Sarah's legs nearly gave out. Emma's voice. Older now, but unmistakably hers. Calling David Daddy in a way that sounded more like a fearful child than a loving daughter. "Not tonight, sweetheart," David's voice replied. "You've been so good lately. You can stay in your real room tonight." The storage unit wasn't Emma's home. It was her punishment. David moved her between the house and that horrible locked room depending on her behavior, depending on how well she obeyed him. Sarah backed away from the fence, her mind racing. She needed help, professional help, but she also needed to be smart about this. If David suspected she knew, he would move Emma somewhere Sarah could never find her. She drove back to the storage facility and used David's key one more time. She needed to see the place again to understand how he'd kept Emma hidden for so long. But when she rolled up the metal door, the storage unit was empty. Everything was gone: the bed, the dresser, the photographs. Even the smell of strawberry shampoo had been scrubbed away. The concrete floor was damp, as if it had been recently mopped with bleach. David knew, somehow he knew, she'd been here. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Having a nice weekend trip, honey? Hope you're finding everything you're looking for." Below the message was a photograph. Emma, sitting at a piano, her face turned toward the camera. She looked older than 16, tired and pale. But she was unmistakably alive and unmistakably trapped. The Shadow of Crystal Lake. Section 5. Sarah stared at the photograph on her phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the device. Emma's eyes in the picture looked directly at the camera, but there was something vacant in her expression, something that spoke of years of careful conditioning and medication. Another text from David appeared. "Come home, Sarah. We need to talk." She knew it was a trap, knew that going back to the house would be walking straight into David's hands. But Emma was somewhere in Millbrook, and Sarah was the only person who knew she was alive. The drive home felt like a funeral procession. Every mile brought her closer to a confrontation she wasn't prepared for, with a man she'd never really known at all. David was waiting in the kitchen when she arrived. He sat at the table with 2 cups of coffee, as if this were any normal evening. As if he hadn't just revealed that he'd been living a double life for 12 years. "Sit down, Sarah." His voice was different now, calmer, more authoritative. The careful, grieving husband mask had finally slipped away. Sarah remained standing by the door, her car keys still clutched in her hand. "Where is she?" "Safe." David took a sip of his coffee. "She's been safe this whole time, safer than she ever would have been with you." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. "With me? I'm her mother?" "You're a drunk." David's voice never rose above a conversational tone. "You passed out that night at the lake. You left our 4-year-old daughter unprotected in a tent full of strangers. Anything could have happened to her. So you took her. I saved her." David leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face. "I gave her a life, education, security, love. Everything she needed to grow up healthy and happy." Sarah thought about the storage unit, the medications, the fear in Emma's voice when she'd asked if she had to go back to the other place. "You kept her prisoner. I kept her safe from a world that would have destroyed her, just like it destroyed you." David gestured toward Sarah with his coffee cup. "Look at yourself. 12 years of guilt and self-medication and therapy. You never would have been able to raise her properly." The terrible thing was that part of Sarah believed him. She had been drinking that night. She had passed out. She had failed to protect her daughter when it mattered most. But that didn't give him the right to steal Emma's entire life. "She asks about me," Sarah said. "The emails mentioned that she remembers me." David's expression darkened. "The medications help with that. Dr. Vance says childhood memories can be adjusted with the right pharmaceutical intervention. You're erasing her memory of me. I'm helping her heal from the trauma of abandonment." Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, that had broken 12 years ago. Something deeper. Some final thread of connection to the man she'd thought she'd married. "I want to see her." "That's not possible." "She's my daughter." "She doesn't remember you." David's voice was gentle now, almost pitying. "To Emma, you're a stranger. A woman from half-remembered dreams that the doctors tell her weren't real." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what David had done. He hadn't just kidnapped Emma. He'd systematically erased Sarah's existence from their daughter's mind. "What happens now?" she asked. David stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Now you have a choice. You can accept that Emma is happy and safe where she is. You can let her continue to live the life I've built for her. Or ... He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah heard the threat clearly enough. "Or you'll move her somewhere I can never find her." "I've had 12 years to plan for this possibility, Sarah. I have resources you don't know about. Connections you can't imagine. If I decide Emma needs to disappear completely, she will." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. David held all the cards. He had Emma, he had money, he had time and preparation, and the advantage of 12 years' worth of careful planning. But he'd made one mistake. He'd shown her where Emma was. "I need time to think," Sarah said. David nodded. "Take all the time you need, but remember, Emma is happy now. She has a life, friends at her homeschool program, hobbies, dreams for the future. Is your need to see her worth destroying all of that?" Sarah went upstairs without answering. She locked the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. She had photos of the storage unit, emails about Emma's medications, financial records showing David's payments for the house in Millbrook. She had enough evidence to send David to prison for the rest of his life. But she also knew that the moment she involved the police, Emma would vanish. David had spent 12 years creating this elaborate prison for their daughter. He would have escape plans. Multiple identities, ways to disappear that would leave no trace. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing. Not an email to the police or the FBI. An email to her brother Mike, the only person who'd never stopped believing that Emma might still be alive. She told him everything. The plan B, the storage unit, the house on Elm Street, the photographs and the medical records, and David's casual admission that he'd been drugging their daughter to erase her memories. She attached every piece of evidence she'd gathered, then scheduled the email to send automatically in 24 hours. If something happened to her, Mike would know the truth. Then Sarah did something she hadn't done in 12 years. She prayed. Not to God. She'd lost her faith the night Emma disappeared. But to Emma herself. To the little girl who used to crawl into bed with her during thunderstorms. To the daughter who'd once made her Mother's Day cards out of construction paper and glitter. She prayed that somewhere in that medicated, controlled mind, some piece of Emma still remembered being loved. The next morning, David left for work at his usual time. Sarah waited until his car disappeared around the corner, then drove straight to 247 Elm Street. She was done being careful, done being afraid, done letting David control her access to her own daughter. Sarah parked directly in front of the house and walked up to the front door. She didn't have a plan beyond knocking and asking to see Emma. But sometimes the simplest approach was the best. Before she could reach the door, it opened. A teenage girl stood in the doorway, her long brown hair catching the morning sunlight. She was taller than Sarah had expected, with David's serious eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin. She wore jeans and a blue sweater that made her look like any normal 16-year-old, except for the fear in her eyes. "Emma!" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. The girl stared at her for a long moment. Then, so quietly Sarah almost couldn't hear it, she said, "I know who you are." And Sarah realized that despite 12 years of medications and manipulation, some bonds couldn't be broken. Some memories were stronger than drugs. Emma stepped aside and Sarah walked into the house where her daughter had been hidden from the world. Where she'd been hidden from her. But not anymore.